Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And today, our latest installment of People's Politics and Prose, Ron Granieri, our host, who's also the FPRI's Center for the Study of the West Executive Director, will be moderating a discussion with Margaret MacMillan, who is the author of a new book called War: How Conflict Shaped Us. A few notes on Ron Granieri, who only needs a few notes. He's currently a professor at the Army War College, and I am behooved to say that any comments he makes are his own and not those of the US government, the US military, or the Army War College. I'd also like to remind you that we're deeply grateful to our sponsors and supporters. And while these events are free of charge, they're not free to us. So we encourage you to donate to FPRI to keep these events coming. A couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please put them down in the chat box. And excuse me, don't put them in the chat box, put them in the Q&A box. Add your questions there. For chat, let us know if you have any technical problems. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh. It's great to be here. Thanks to everybody. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's new program of conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us on Zoom, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. War is the father of all and king of all. He renders some gods, others men. He makes some slaves, others free. So wrote, allegedly, the famously aphoristic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who also declared, quote, "War is common to all and strife is justice, and that all things come into being through strife," close quote. Many thinkers and political leaders have since quoted those words, sometimes with gusto, sometimes with regret. Even those who have dreamed of liberating humanity from the scourge of war have recognized the paradoxical nature of this most destructive of human activities, which has also led to immortal creations in art, politics, and society. We may wish to escape it, and many of us may prefer to avoid studying or considering warfare, though even there we can remember the equally famous aphorism from Trotsky: "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." In her latest book, War: How Conflict Shapes Us, Professor Margaret MacMillan brings a brilliant and prolific career's learning to focus on the question of how we should think about the role of war in creating the world we know. Even as her work ranges across the centuries and covers diverse topics from origins of wars to peacemaking to the impact on civilians and the impact on arts and culture, Professor MacMillan reminds us of the internal paradoxes of war, agreeing with novelist Frederick Manning, whom she quotes as saying, "War is waged by men, not by beasts or by gods. It is a peculiarly human activity. To call it a crime against mankind is to miss at least half its significance. It is also the punishment of a crime." So how should we best confront the paradoxical realities of war? How has war shaped human society over the ages? Are human beings destined to conflict, or is war something that modern society can aspire to overcome? These questions, and yours, will guide us in discussion with our guest, Margaret MacMillan. Margaret MacMillan is Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford and Professor of History at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD from Oxford and became a member of the faculty at Ryerson University in 1975. In 2002, she became provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and from 2007 to 2017, she was the warden of St. Antony's College at Oxford. Her previous books include Paris 1919, The War That Ended Peace, Nixon and Mao, Dangerous Games, and Women of the Raj, one of the most important scholars writing in international history and war studies today. We are delighted to have her with us this afternoon. Good evening, Professor MacMillan.
Good evening from Oxford, and thank you. That was a very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even virtually. I wish I was there, but at the time we're not traveling, are we? So
Alas, no, but it is great to have you here. So I want to ask you, how did this book come to be? What made you decide to write this kind of a extended essay, if you will, on war?
It was partly an opportunity that came up. I think about 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to go into the BBC in London, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And I thought perhaps they wanted me to just talk about the commemoration of the First World War, because I'd given them a bit of advice on that. And I went in for a chat. And to my amazement, the very nice woman I was talking to, who was director of BBC's Radio 4, said, we think you should do something called the Wreath Lectures, which are an annual series of lectures the British Broadcasting Corporation has on a wide variety of subjects. And I was floored, because it's a considerable something to be asked to do it. And she said, what would I like to talk about? And we batted around a few ideas. And then I thought, I've always been interested in war. It's gone through so much of the history I've studied, because I study the history of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I look at things like imperialism and movements of peoples and international relations. So I said, what about war? And she thought it was a good idea. And so I went home and thought, what have I done? What have I just signed myself up to? But it was a wonderful opportunity, because in a way, anyone who does the history of the 19th and 20th centuries is aware of war. And in fact, for most centuries in world history, whatever part of the world you're studying, war is present. As you said, war is interested in us, unfortunately. And so I learned a lot. When you give lectures, you're forced to think about things in organized ways. It was a wonderful experience. I did 5 lectures, and then I sat down to write the book. And then, of course, I got interested in all sorts of other things, so the book got longer. But I managed to get it done. But it's, as you say, it's a series of essays. It's not a complete history of war.
Mm-hmm.
And there are such books, and they're enormous, because there's been an awful lot of war for a very long time in human history. But for me, it was an opportunity to think about some of the aspects of war, how it affects even the language we use, some of our expressions. And we talk often about winning the battle against things or confronting something. We've been talking about winning the battle against COVID. We use the language of war, I think, often without thinking. And often our cities or our railway stations are named after battles. We see statues and memorials to wars all over our countries. And a great deal of the literature we read, the movies we watch, even the music we listen to has in some way been affected by war. And so it's something that, without, I think, us even realizing it, permeates a lot of our thinking and a lot of the ways in which we react and interact.
Well, and I am curious, the Wreath Lecture is very famous. And if I remember from reading in the book, you mentioned that you delivered one of them in Beirut. Is that correct?
Yes, we go to 5 different places. The first one's always in London.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave that one in the BBC Theatre, which was used as a dormitory in the Second World War, because a lot of people had to stay the night there. And being the BBC, it was always known as Auntie. And being the BBC, they put a curtain down the middle, so men were on one side and women were on the other side, quite rightly. But we decided on Beirut because we wanted somewhere non-European.
Mm-hmm. And
Beirut has seen an awful lot of war. The city has been there for a very long time. It's had invaders come by sea and by land. It's been sacked. Its peoples have gone through wars. And of course, it's gone recently through a dreadful civil war. And so it seemed a place to go that would have resonance as we were talking about war. And I chose to talk about civilians in war there,
mm-hmm.
because the people of Beirut have suffered so much, as civilians so often do, from war.
And so then this gets to the big question. You start the book with this and you return to it, right? The ongoing discussion, right? Are human beings fundamentally peaceful and occasionally plagued by war, or are we fundamentally, so the Rousseau vision of us as noble, peaceful savages, or is the world Hobbesian? Is it solitary? Is life solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short? And should we be more surprised when there is peace, when there is war? Is it a question worth asking after I've asked it? But are human beings inherently warlike?
Well, it's a fascinating question. And it's one I think that we've debated ever since we've been debating such things. I mean, we go back a long, long way in our discussions of war and what it means. And I think we have to make a distinction between human beings as individuals. We have a certain character which we've inherited through evolution, although of course we have free will as well, in my opinion. But there are things that have been bred into us by evolution. We tend to be apprehensive in situations we don't understand. We have a flight instinct. I mean, these sorts of things are probably part of our evolutionary heritage, and we often will lash out when we're afraid. We can use violence, but that's very different from war. War is highly organized. And so I want to look at not why individuals might have aggressive tendencies, which I think is a fascinating question. And I think, you know, the huge debate, Steven Pinker, among others, have been engaged in. But I really want to look at the organized conflict, because war is very purposive and it's very organized. And often it takes a lot of work to turn someone into someone who will fight, you know, because we have other instincts we've inherited. And I've just finished reading a fascinating book called Humankind by the Dutch historian, economist, I hope I got his name right, Bregman, who argues that we have strong altruistic tendencies as well. And we have strong capacities for peace, and we have strong capacities for kindness. And so what it seems to me is that what makes a difference between us fighting in organized groups and not, or working for peace or not, is something to do with organization itself and culture. So that I think people are made into those who will fight by their cultures. And I think that's very important. You know, you think of how much training it takes someone to make a soldier. You can't just put someone in a uniform and say, all right, go out there, obey the rules, be prepared to sacrifice your life, be prepared to get out there and fight. It takes often months and often years of training to turn someone into someone who will make a good member of the military. Well, you know better than me because you teach the military, I think, often. So I really became fascinated by this notion of organization. And it seems, and again, of course, the further back you go, we have to say it seems, because the evidence is less and less. And the further back you go into prehistory, before people began to write and make records. But it seems that once we began to organize ourselves into tribes or clans, like my Scottish ancestors, and particularly once we began to settle down, when we became agriculturalists, we began to get richer in a way. We could produce more excess, we could support more people, we could begin to have different social classes. But once we settled down, of course, it became more difficult to move, and we had things that others might want to take from us.
Right.
And so some of the early human settlements show signs of walls, and you don't build a wall unless there's something you want to keep out usually. And we've also found early examples of graves which contain the bodies of those who look like they've had trauma and look like they might have died fighting. And so human organization, unfortunately, seems to go sort of hand in hand through history with human capacity to fight. And the more organized we got, alas, the better we got at fighting.
Right. Well, and you mentioned this in the book too. You mentioned the work of Charles Tilly, the idea that that war made the state and the state made war. That connection between, you know, you have to be organized in order to fight wars, and therefore you create organizations. How should we make sense of this idea of war as I won't say a positive, but let's say war as a creative force as well as a destructive force?
It's very hard for us to think like that, I think. And I had a lot of trouble coming to terms with it, because we think of war as destructive, and we think of war as something horrific, all of which is absolutely true. But war does speed up certain kinds of development or encourage certain kinds of development. And of course, the better organized you get, the better you are at fighting, the more you can control larger quantities of land and larger numbers of people. I mean, the Roman Empire was built through war, and it was maintained partly through military force, but of course it was also maintained because a lot of people found living within it something they wanted to do. And people wanted to move into the Roman Empire, not out. And that was because the Roman Empire provided a sort of peace and stability, which meant you could go about your daily lives, you could trade, you could travel, you could acquire goods, often from very far off places. So the quality of your life was better. So it's can bring, and Hobbes talked about this in the creation of this giant sort of force he called Leviathan, the beginnings of the modern state. War can help to create a sort of social organization that will create peaceful circumstances. But there must be other ways of doing it. The trouble is we are not very good at finding those ways. And what war can also do, and I think you referred to this, war can also speed up things like improvements in science and technology and changes in social organization, which might have happened anyway, might not, we'll never know, but which are often beneficial in peacetime.
Well, and isn't it funny, since you said at the beginning, where we talk about fighting the war against COVID or the war on poverty, and William James, of course, talked about that we need to find the moral equivalent of war, because somehow we can't quite escape the notion that it is the level of sacrifice called upon that a society is called upon to offer in war. That's the metaphor we're always groping for when we imagine some kind of common activity. What's wrong with us, Margaret, that it takes talking about war to get human beings to work together?
Well, it's not just war, but I do
Right.
think something about it. It's when we're faced with a big crisis, a crisis which is a threat to ourselves, to our families, to our ways of life. I mean, existential crisis, a
Hmm.
crisis which threatens our very existence. And we seem to be able then to
Hmm.
pull together and to focus on things. And so I think we're seeing a very good example of that in the current pandemic.
Hmm.
We are reacting in ways which, if you had said a year ago, we're all going to accept, or lots of us are going to accept wearing face masks and accepting lockdown, and we're going to change our ways of life completely, and we're going to accept more government interference in our lives, and we're going to accept more government spending.
Hmm.
If I'd said that a year ago before the pandemic, people would have said, don't be silly, that isn't going to happen. And so it's not just war, is when we face giant challenges that we have a capacity to work together. And we know we have that capacity because even in peacetime, we can see communities who will pull together to help each other. And, if there's a flood, if there's something goes wrong, even if it's a small crisis, I think we have that capacity. It's how we build on that capacity to work together in peacetime for the sorts of things that we'd like. I mean, it shouldn't take a war to make us want to improve social care, make us want to pay better pensions, make us want to look after veterans better. But sometimes, unfortunately, it seems to take a major crisis like war to really get us thinking about how we can make our societies better.
Right. Well, and I see a question already in the Q&A that I was going to ask you anyway, so I want to bring this in. Mark Feldman raises the issue of gender and war, and as war as a particularly male activity. How do you, both in your book and in your other studies, right? How should we try to understand the connection between war and the reinforcement of traditional gender roles?
Well, I think it's a very important connection, and I think we do need to understand it. And it's something I've tried to think a lot about. Surprisingly, there's some very good work done on it, but not as much as I would have expected. And it seems to be, as one leading feminist writer said, it seems to be perhaps because women don't like to think about war. They don't like to think of themselves as beings who might get involved in war. They see it as something that men do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to look at the gendered nature of war. And again, I would go, if you accept my argument, you don't have to, but if you accept my argument that culture is very important in producing those who fight. And we know that there have been warrior cultures in the past. I mean, Sparta is a classic example, or Prussia, where the upper class young men, the Junker, the landed gentry, were brought up to see themselves as potential soldiers. They were brought up to see being a soldier as a noble career and other things as not being noble. And so they were brought up to be very brave and to accept pain and the prospect of death without flinching, and to take on leadership roles. So we know that culture is important. And I think culture has been very important in why it's been men who fight and not women. I think a lot of cultures have simply assumed that it's men who fight and it's women who stay at home and tend the home fires. And so women have been encouraged to be the nurturers, which of course, biology means that they are the ones who bear the children. And so nurturing is something that may be biologically encouraged as well. But I think really culturally, women have not been encouraged to fight. And we now know that when women are trained in the armed forces, they can fight as much as men. They can, if necessary, be as ruthless as men. It used to be thought that the Amazons were just an imaginary and mythological beings. In fact, there seems to be evidence that there really were in the classical world women who fought and who wore armor. And there's certainly been the discovery of Viking graves with the corpses of women in them. And, for a long time, when women started coming into armed forces around the world in the 20th century, they didn't and weren't expected to be in combat roles, but increasingly they are. Right. And as far as I can see, their record in combat roles is as good or bad as men in combat roles. And so it really suggests to me that the reason women haven't fought traditionally has had far more to do with culture than biology.
Interesting. Well, and certainly with increases in improvements in technology, that one does not rely on the same level of brute strength that lots of different types of human beings can engage in warfare today than maybe would have done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm related to this. If you don't mind my asking, what about being a woman and a scholar who studies war? How have you dealt with the gendered politics of the historical profession?
Well, it is striking, particularly in my generation, that very few of those studying international relations or the history of war have been women. There have been a few exceptions, and I think of people like Barbara Tuchman, who did study war, but she didn't have a job in a traditional university. But I think that's changing. And I was very lucky because it never occurred to me I couldn't do it. Perhaps it should have done. But I simply was interested in war, and I was interested in international relations and in relations between countries. And so I simply did it. Occasionally, and you can imagine I don't answer very positively. Occasionally I've had people saying, why are you worrying your little head about these things? But not too often.
Not too often. And I hope with decreasing frequency, one can hope.
And I try and be polite, but I say it is possible for, we all study things. You don't have to be the thing to study it.
Very good point. Yes, those kinds of questions. When we think about this, because this also relates to a question Lawrence Husick asks about war in society and the relationship of hierarchies, whether they be gender hierarchies or social hierarchies. Do you think that war does war reinforce hierarchies, or do societies that have better hierarchical organization, do they succeed more at war?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think all societies have hierarchies, or virtually all. I mean, we like to dream of societies which everyone is on a basis of equality and which cooperate freely, but they're very, I mean, there are some, but very few examples of those. Most societies have hierarchies of one sort or another. And I think it depends very much on the nature of society about who's in the hierarchy, who's up and who's down, and what is valued. And so in societies which relied on war to maintain themselves and to, if necessary, expand their borders, those who could fight were considered as very important. And in the Middle Ages, for example, not that many people fought. It tended to be the people, once the horse came in and once armor began to be used, you had to have a lot of money to have a horse with armor. It took a very large amount of land. It's been estimated something like 300 acres to support a knight in armor on horseback. And so you couldn't have many people doing that. But of course, those who had the weapons, had the horses, had the training, could be tremendously influential and powerful because they could control others. And so I think it depends very much on the nature of societies. I mean, in many societies today, having technical ability is much more important than being able to carry out war. And so it depends on the type of society. And all societies have hierarchies. But in a number of societies in the past, we've seen those who are able to fight and those who have the capacity to fight and can afford the weapons as dominating those societies.
Although then there's an interesting paradox here too that you discuss in the book. And that is that as technology is developed in warfare, right, the individual skill or the individual importance of that rich guy on horseback could be severely undermined by the existence of the longbow or the development of pikes. You think about, to use great English examples, right? Crécy and Agincourt are two good examples where technology means that technology breaks down hierarchy in war. And how should we make sense of that, right? The idea that war can be both a leveler and and something that encourages hierarchy.
Well, I think always in war, you will get a type of fighting which will then produce its own opposite. And the knight on horseback was formidable if you were on the ground. It was a terrifying spectacle to have this thing thundering down on you. But eventually people learned to deal with it. And you mentioned the longbow, which was capable of piercing the armor, killing the horse. And of course, once a knight was off his horse, he was like a turtle on his back. It was very difficult to move because of the weight of the armor. And they were often defenseless once they were unhorsed. And so I think you always get this back and forth in war. What we saw in the modern age was industrialized war, where individual acts of heroism came to matter less and less. And they still did, but what was more important was simply to be in large numbers. But I think, not all societies have depended on war for hierarchy. China, traditional Chinese society, although certainly it had great generals and it spent a lot of time fighting. I mean, there is this sort of, I think, myth that the Chinese didn't fight, they did it all peacefully. And that's not how they expanded their borders, quite frankly, and that's not how they repelled invaders. But in Chinese society, the scholar was always more valued than the general. And so that was a different set of values. It doesn't mean you don't have the military in such societies, but the values of those societies value them as being less than those who do other sorts of things.
Well, and if that being the case, where do you fall on the discussion about how the development of society, the increasing value on technology and trade, the increasing value on economic interdependence, that it makes war not only less attractive, but less likely.
I'd like to think so, and I think a lot of us like to think so, but not sure that history bears that out. We think of our own age as the age of globalization, but we forget that there was another great age of globalization before the First World War, before 1914. Time of tremendous expansion of international travel, international trade, international investment, thanks to new means of communication, thanks to steamships, thanks to the telegraph, thanks to railways. It became possible for people to move around the world and for trade and investment to increase enormously. Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners before the First World War. They ended up on opposite sides. I'm not sure that economic interdependence and increased trade and increased investment necessarily means you're going to be friendlier to each other. And this was assumed. A lot of people before the First World War wrote books saying, a very famous one by Norman Angell, The Great Illusion, wrote books saying, there'll be no point in going to war now because we're so economically interdependent. Everyone would recognize that. They wouldn't be so foolish. The trouble with war is it has, as Clausewitz said, its own logic, and it has its own momentum. And once it starts, it is impossible, I think, often to control. And so, no, I don't think greater economic and other sorts of interdependence make us less likely to fight each other. It may actually exacerbate tensions by forcing us to deal with each other.
I suppose you could even consider before the First World War, right, that Britain and France were even governed by relatives, right, and that didn't stop it, right? Cousins didn't stop cousins from fighting each other. Britain and Germany, I should say, Britain and Germany, right?
Yeah, and Germany and Russia.
As
well. I mean, the three rulers of Germany, Britain, and Russia are all related. Well, I always say to people, what a family fight can be like.
Also very true.
Yeah.
Well, and what about the relationship between types of government and warfare, right? That there's a lot of hope in the democratic peace, that democracies won't fight each other, and that therefore one way to make war less likely is to make democracy more prevalent. What do you think of that argument?
Well, public opinion is funny, isn't it? I mean, public opinion can push governments in ways they may not want to go. And we assume that democratic public opinion is likely to be peaceful, but I think we've seen again examples of where it is not. And in many of the European countries before the First World War, and there's a huge argument, of course, about what is a democracy and what isn't, do we ever have a proper democracy? But Germany had universal manhood suffrage. All men above a certain age could vote. You could call that democratic. It had a Reichstag with a lot of powers. Britain and France had what you could call democracy, although not everyone in those countries could vote. So, I think public opinion before the First World War often pushed governments into more confrontational stances with each other than they might have wanted. I mean, one British prime minister said, I really don't like public opinion. He said it's, all these people shouting at me to do things I don't want. And so to assume that people in democracies are naturally peaceful, I don't think is necessarily so. We don't know. But, if something affects your country, you may well change your mind on whether or not you want to fight. I mean, I think a lot of Americans before Pearl Harbor were not keen on the idea of intervention in the European war. And I think they had good reason not to want to get involved. Pearl Harbor changed that. I mean, I think overnight, Americans were prepared to go to war to defend themselves.
Well, and so continuing on this theme about the relationship of society and culture to warfare, Matthew Hearn asks about the idea about how primitive societies had more ritualized approaches to warfare as opposed to modern industrial societies. And Clausewitz talks about the eternal nature of war, but its changing character. And so how do you see the character of wars changing over time to match the changes in society and culture over the ages?
I think they do. I mean, I think there's always been ritual in war, and the ways we used to declare war, the ways we make peace. I mean, those rituals haven't ever completely gone away. And I don't think we should be too forgiving of early societies. They managed to kill each other quite a bit. They certainly had rituals and they had days when they wouldn't fight. But they also did a great deal of killing. But I think changes in societies do bring about changes in the way we fight. And if you have a very hierarchical society, those who tend to fight tend to be those who are in a very small part of that society. when you have a society in which more people have a share in that society, more people feel that they have a part of that society, more people will be willing to fight. And of course, with the modern age, we get the capacity to make bigger armies and bigger navies, so that we need more people to fight. So I'm not sure really that I would make that much distinction between early societies and our own. I mean, what's true of today is we tend not to need, at least in the very advanced countries, we tend not to need the vast amounts of numbers. We don't need, we can't say manpower anymore. We don't need the human power anymore because of the technology. But we still see wars around the world, often civil wars, in which it's still important to have a lot of people fighting and which draw in a lot of people.
Well, and I see, to circle back, I see a question from Ann Butchert. She asks the question of, do we see, or do we have enough examples of how societies in which women play a greater role in the leadership? Do those societies display themselves to be less warlike or differently warlike than other societies? I realize I don't know how big the sample sizes are, but I'm curious what you've come across in your work.
Well, not a very big sample size, but on the whole, I think women, when they get into power, may have a different management style. I think women are often better at listening, partly perhaps because culturally we've had to listen, we've had to sort of observe. Because I'm not talking about you. That sounded ruder than I meant. But partly because women were not expected to participate in public life in the past, and not expected to take control. That they often developed the capacity to listen and to assess those whom they were dealing with. And I think even today you will see the sort of leadership style of women leaders in the COVID pandemic, for example, has been often rather more consensual and has tried to bring people along. But are women, when they take positions of authority, less likely to go to war? And I don't think so. The pressures for war, the needs for war remain, whether or not it's a man or a woman in the job. And we have, I think, quite a lot of examples of women who have presided over states who have also presided over wars. Maria Theresa, Catherine the Great in the past, but much closer to the present, Mrs. Thatcher.
Mrs. Thatcher definitely comes to mind.
Golda Meir. The women, when they are in those positions, have to make the same sorts of decisions that men do about whether or not their countries will go to war. And I don't think there's enough evidence to say that they're more likely to opt in favor of peace, quite frankly.
That's a very, very important observation. And Mrs. Thatcher not only managed to go to war, but to win a war over a general, right? So she beat General Galtieri. So which one of them was tougher? I think the history provides us with an answer there.
Well, the famous thing that General Galtieri said, he really misunderstood her. They found the minutes of the Argentinian cabinet. And someone said, what will Mrs. Thatcher do? He said, oh, that silly old cow, she won't do anything.
Well, I'm unfortunately, we don't have a transcript of what he talked about later on that summer of 1982. That would have been quite interesting to see. Razvan Ionescu asked a question which relates to some of the things we've already spoken about, but the idea that war, famine, disease, right, the four horsemen, war, death, pestilence, that in some ways modern society has reduced the prevalence of these scourges, but has not eliminated them. But I am curious about how we imagine the way that further social development, right? Because obviously a war is terrible for the people who are involved, even if we're not talking about massive interstate wars as in the past. But how should we imagine society moving forward, finding ways to limit, to control the spread of war in the way that we've tried to limit, to control the spread of disease or famine, for that matter?
I think we have to hope that we will, because war has become so terrible now, and the capacity for destruction has become so great that I think we're all in trouble if a war breaks out. But I worry because I think the international controls of war have become weakened in the passing of the years. I think we've forgotten why we wanted them. We have not strengthened the international organizations that can help countries to come together and discuss issues between them. And I think we see now a number of powers investing very heavily in war-making capacity, and that worries me. And I think those of us who live in the fortunate parts of the world, perhaps, which have known a lot of peace since 1945, don't quite understand, or often don't quite understand, just how wars can happen, how they can happen often without people particularly wanting them to happen. You know, people talk about the long peace since 1945. It's not been a long peace for everyone. For a lot of people around the world, war has been very much part of their lives. And you think of the wars in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, in parts of Central Asia, in parts of Asia. I mean, these are wars. It's been estimated there's been a war pretty much every year since 1945. And these are wars that have killed a lot of people in the millions, and also made many more millions refugees, or damaged many more millions. And so war is still very much with us. And I think that's why we need to think very seriously about it. I mean, it is something that we need to collectively try and deal with, as we need to collectively deal with things that cross boundaries. COVIDs, pandemics don't respect boundaries. Climate change doesn't respect boundaries. And so we do have a number of these large international global problems, and I would include the prevention of war among them. And I think this is something we can, perhaps by human nature, we can only worry about so many things at once, but I think we should be worrying about nuclear proliferation, for example. And we should be worrying about the number of failed states in the world, which become the places where conflict just goes on, but can also become bases for conflict elsewhere and terrorist attacks elsewhere, and can destabilize their neighborhoods and further afield. And so unfortunately, I think conflict is still very much part of our world. And there are still, I think, leaders of states who think they can use war as an instrument of state. And I think that's dangerous. We've seen that throughout history. Leaders who say, I'll just have a nice little neat war and I'll take that bit of land I want, or I'll defeat that enemy. And often the war, as I've said, will get out of their control. In the First World War, they were all planning for neat, short, sharp campaigns. They thought the war, or many thought the war, would be over by Christmas 1914, and look what they got instead. Right. And so I think we have to be very careful. And this is why, I don't want to alarm people, but this is why I think we need to take war seriously. And as you said in that wonderful Trotsky quote, war is going to be interested in us.
Well, and this gets to an interesting question as well about the place of the study of war in our educational systems. That certainly there's a particular attitude that too much of the study of history in the past has been focused on wars. And so therefore we should learn about other things, which I think is a very sensible position. However, how should we understand the role that studying war can play in helping us not only to understand the wars of the past, but to actually equip us to limit conflicts in the future, or understand the possibilities of conflict in the future?
Well, I think it's very important to study war. And, history goes through phases. And when I went to university, we studied mostly political, international history with some economic history. And war was something that was certainly part of that history. And then history expanded and shifted its focus. And one of the things it did, history changes in response, or the study of history changes in response to changes in society. And so in the 1970s, women's history became much more a subject of study, because there was a feminist movement, or feminist movements. And again, the study of race has become very important, the study of previously marginalized groups, which I think is very important indeed. The study of things like emotions and fashions and food, all of which make up part of what we are to be human, I think is very important. But unfortunately, I think it's been sometimes at the cost of looking at things like the evolution of political institutions, sometimes at the cost of looking at the relations between countries and peoples, and sometimes at the cost of looking at war and how it can be, how it starts, how it can be controlled, and how it can be prevented. And that, I think, is very unfortunate. I think there is, in a lot of universities, particularly I think in North America, a sense that somehow if you want to study war, if you want to study international relations, you want to study politics, you are yourself obsessed by power. And I don't think that's right. I mean, we study lots of things we don't like, and people who study discrimination don't, I assume, approve of discrimination, or people who study slavery or imperialism are not approving of it, but they want to understand very important phenomena. And I think it's unfortunate. Too often, I think the study of war is written off as sort of something that people do that's really boring, and they look at sort of regiments marching up hills and down again, and they look at naval battles, and they look at weapons. That's not what those of us who study war do, and we haven't done for a long time. I mean, what we look at is this deep relationship between war and society, how wars start, how the conduct of war is affected by society, and how that in turn affects societies. And I really don't think we can understand even our own world without understanding the part that war has played. You know, without the Second World War, without the Allies winning the Second World War, I think the world would have been a very different place.
And so the question is always what we may learn lessons. It's what we decide to do with them once we've learned them, I suppose, or that we have, but perhaps we just have to be open to the prospect that we have never completely learned them and we need to continue to study them.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
Well, how should we? There are a lot of questions coming in from listeners, which is very gratifying, and I want to figure out how we can address as many as possible. But one of them that appears to be from several folks, including Richard Millett, is how should we understand the types of wars that result from different causes or different impulses, right? Is there a difference, or should we understand the difference between wars that emerge from economic competition versus wars that are built around religious enthusiasm or that are built around ethnic grievance? I suppose to a certain extent, right? Once the killing starts, the dead are dead and the killers are killers. But how should we understand the way that different types of causes can lead to different types of wars?
Well, I think the cause can affect the way you fight the war and what you feel about the enemy, and can also make it easier or more difficult to end the war. You know, I think in the 18th century, in Europe, you got a lot of what were called cabinet wars, and these were governments dominated by very small hierarchies, you know, usually the aristocracy and the crowned head, and they would make wars for particular goals. And when they'd achieved that particular goal, often a piece of land or you know, a prize of some sort, when they'd achieved it, they'd sit down and make peace, because the passions of their peoples hadn't been engaged, and they didn't necessarily hate the enemy. The enemy was just someone that they had to deal with, and war seemed the most efficient way of dealing with it. I mean, we can disagree about that, but those wars didn't have the sort of passion in them. I remember reading a memoir years ago of a British officer fighting up on the northwest frontier in India, which was pretty tough fighting. It was up in the hills, and they were fighting against Pathans, who were very formidable fighters. And he said, you know, they're good chaps to fight against. I don't mind at all. And they try and kill us, we try and kill them, and that's all in a day's sort of work. He said, what I really dread is when the publics get involved in wars, because the passions will get higher and it'll be much harder to fight. And we found that even in the First World War, those actually in the front lines often had a sort of fellow feeling and didn't feel particular hatred to each other. Not always, but often. It was the publics back home. And I think that wars fought for a grand goal. Wars fought for peace, funnily, can be very terrible, because if you're fighting for peace, anyone who's in your way needs to be eliminated.
Right.
And wars fought for ideologies, whether religious or political, whether they're communism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism, can be terrifying, because you're fighting for the righteous cause. Either you're fighting to make a better world here on earth, or you're fighting for the heavenly world. And therefore, again, anyone standing in your way, in fact, deserves to be eliminated, because in some sense they're evil. They're an obstacle to this wonderful goal. And so I think wars that are fought for great causes can often be the most terrifying of all. Civil wars too.
Civil wars
are a conflict within the same family and community. And you can't understand why the other side wants to break it up, why the other side wants to do it. I mean, I think of the American Civil War, you know, which really brought out these sort of passions, particularly as the war went on. You know, the South has to be destroyed. And it's not just, as Sherman said, it's not just the soldiers on the Southern side, it's Southern society, which means the civilians.
Well, since you mentioned the Civil War, John Curtis has an interesting question about how we should remember wars and how we commemorate them. So when a society commemorates its wars, perhaps it remembers, say the British remember their colonial wars or particular battles, or in the United States, when we figure out how should we commemorate battles of the Civil War. You know, what should we name things, for example? But how should societies, and how have societies over time managed this question of commemoration and valorizing of their warlike past?
It's complicated because often the commemoration will be something the government wants. You know, you often get a commemoration directed from above.
Right.
But what is really interesting is you often get people from below saying, no, we want to commemorate it this way. In London, in England, there's a cenotaph which was put up to the dead. not to any one person. And there's an annual Remembrance Day ceremony there. And initially it was only going to be temporary. It was put up in 1919 as a temporary measure. It was made out of canvas and wood, and the public actually took it to heart, as they did the body of the unknown soldier. And they sort of made pilgrimages to it, and they gathered in crowds, and the government realized it had to put something permanent. And so commemoration is complicated because it depends who wants to do it and where it's coming from. And it's also something I think every generation thinks about again, because how we think about the past changes because we've changed. And I think that's as it should be. And I think sometimes we should forget about the past. I mean, sometimes you can remember the past too much. You know, that famous quip of Winston Churchill's that the Balkans has more history than it can consume. And I think that is important. And sometimes I think we need to shift how we commemorate. I mean, I myself feel that too often, certainly in my own country, Canada, we commemorate the First World War as something in which Canada was on the winning side, which is true. We commemorate it, I think, too much as a victory. 100 years later, particularly given the changes in Canada itself, there are an awful lot of people living in Canada whose ancestors were on the other side. And I personally think that we should be now commemorating the First World War as something that was a horror and a catastrophe for European civilization and affected a lot of us, no matter where we came from. And so I think how we think about the past depends on how we've changed. And I think sometimes we need to rethink how we've been doing commemorations and how we think about the past. I think we need to try. And if we really care about, you know, building bridges to each other and trying to remove war from the face of the planet, then we should think of ways in which we've all suffered as a result of war. And it doesn't mean, it's not rewriting the history. I never think that, but I think trying to sometimes put it into a different context. And as you know, there's a lot of debate in Britain at the moment about statues, as there is in the United States. And some of the statues are of people who won colonial victories against peoples who were less well armed, perhaps, and who suffered terrible losses. So maybe we need to put those into context, and maybe we need to acknowledge those who were on the losing side there too.
Well, excuse me, the idea that the further events recede into the past, the more likely we can, or perhaps the easier we can adopt a kind of tragic vision, that we no longer feel as though we have to take sides in the conflict, and we can talk about how terrible it was for everyone. This gets into an interesting question about wars have often played a central role in not only official commemoration, but also in, let's say, officially approved visions of history, right? Is that we need to have our particular things that we have to celebrate, and you have to know how you're supposed to feel on these days because of these events. Yeah. If societies move towards a more tragic vision that celebrate, I can't remember who initially said it, but somebody said that to ask who won the First World War is like asking who won the earthquake. That it's a terrible thing that happens to everyone. So how should we, if we take that tragic view, like what if somebody says, well, Canada has to celebrate this war as a victory because that's the only way that it will make Canadians feel good about being Canadians?
I think we have to challenge that. I'm always rather suspicious when governments want to get involved in writing history, because they often do it for their own ends. And right. We know that in certain countries you will get political leaders often unscrupulously dragging up the past in order to turn one people against another. This is why I think sometimes remembering too much can be very dangerous. I mean, when Yugoslavia began to break up in the 1990s, the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 became much more of an issue. I mean, a lot of people commemorated, but a lot of people had forgotten about it, but it was used by Serb nationalist politicians to make the Serbs feel they were threatened and to make them feel that they had to fight their neighbors. And so I think we need to question when governments say this is the way we're going to remember. As citizens, I think we need to say, wait a minute, why? Why do you want us to remember it this way? I think these things should be debated, But on the other hand, I don't go with the view that everyone who fought in the First World War was a misguided, deluded person, which is sometimes a contemptuous view. People then thought they knew what they were doing. They thought they were fighting for a cause. They were fighting for a cause. And I think we have to treat people in the past as autonomous, respect their choices, even if we disapprove of them.
You have a great story in the book about how the musical Oh, What a Lovely War, which was developed in the 1960s as a very much an anti-war document, is produced at a time when there are still living veterans of the First World War. And it turns out that many of them went to the show and loved it because they got a chance to sing some of the old songs of their past.
Yeah.
I think about that because Oh, What a Lovely War is a perfect example of a younger generation painting the older generation as fools and knaves, and yet the people who lived through it have a completely different vision, and they're actually delighted to be able to hear those music hall songs again.
Yeah, no, apparently in the interval, a friend of mine was there. I saw it very early on too, but I don't remember it happening because I think I was too young to go into the bar. But a friend of mine who's a bit older went into the bar and said it was jammed in the interval with all these old soldiers saying, "Wasn't that great, Bill? Doesn't that take you back?" You know, and I think it was very interesting. Immediately after the First World War, it's certainly on the winning side, the war was commemorated as a rightful war, and it was a triumphal war. And it was only in the 30s that this other view began to come in. So we have to remember that how we remember the past does change. It's bound to.
And that's why we keep talking about it and re-examining it. Mark Brennan has a question that I think a lot of your fans would like to know generally about how you work on your topics, but also how do you deal with the emotional toll of writing the history of tragic events?
Well, yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I work on my topics in a rather sort of chaotic way, at least so it feels. I mean, I begin to think of the subject, I begin to collect material, and then I have an idea of where I'm going, and I begin to sort it out. You begin to sift, and you begin to think, well, this is how, and you begin to try and develop a skeleton. You think this, you know, I need a chapter on this, I need a chapter on that, I need to explore this. But you're guided actually as you go along. You get more interested in certain things. I mean, I didn't realize when I began thinking about war for the lectures and then the book that I'd get so interested in gender and war. You know, it was something that I got drawn into, and that's part of the joy of researching a subject. You find all these new things, and so it's a sort of slow process. And once I begin to write, I usually have 2 or 3 months before I start writing. I think I'm never going to get down to it. I can't do it. I've got too much material. And once I start to write, I'm usually fine, and then it sort of takes over. Sorry, what was the second? I've forgotten the second.
Well, I guess, is there an emotional toll that comes with writing about tragic subjects, or what do you do for fun when you're spending your days writing about the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people?
It's on your mind a lot. It's very hard not to think about it, and there are moments. You know, when I was writing, I got to July 1914, which was the last crucial month before Europe went to war. And I found myself, as I was writing about it, saying, don't do it. Don't do it. You still have time. You do not need to do it. But there's a curious process, and you don't ever want to get hardened to it. You don't ever want to get detached, but you have to write about it. And I felt the same when I was writing what it's like to be in combat and what soldiers feel. And I know I'll never fully understand it, but you try your best because they have often tried to explain it. But there's a curious thing that happens. I mean, when I finished, and I tend to write my books in their order usually, when I finished my book on the outbreak of the First World War, I finished my conclusion, I put it down, I went out and had dinner with friends. And the next morning I woke up and I thought, there's something odd. And I realized it was the first morning in about 2 years I had woken up without thinking about the First World War. I'd somehow got it off my mind.
I guess that's one way to work through these things, right? Is to actually finish writing a book about them.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you an unfair question because historians don't like to make predictions, but I'm going to ask you a forward-looking question that has come up. Stephen Jackson asked this, and it's implied in a couple of other questions as well, is when you think about the contemporary international situation compared to your study of other, say, pre-war circumstances, do you see any parallels? Do you see any particular dangers that face us today?
I do. And we know that history doesn't repeat itself, and we know that the parallels are just ways of thinking about the present. But what worries me is the great power rivalry between the United States and China, but also between India and China. And these are organized states with huge military capacities. China has been spending huge amounts of money on its military. And I do find that worrying because I think you're getting people in different capitals around the world, and perhaps particularly in Beijing and Washington, but also I think in Delhi, who are saying, well, you know, we may have to fight a war and it's something we may have to contemplate. And, you know, once you begin actually thinking you might have to fight a war, I think that's a dangerous sort of threshold to go over, because you begin both to make plans, which you have to do. The military, as we know, have to make plans. That's their job. But you begin to think of it more as a real possibility. The other thing that worries me is you begin to look at the other side as an enemy. So everything the other side does feeds into your apprehensions about that other side. And I do find that worrying. We know this doesn't have to happen. I mean, Britain and the United States talked about war in the 1890s, and they didn't fight. Cooler heads on both sides said this is nuts, and they came to an understanding and both backed down a bit, and that was, you know, and I'm hoping this will happen, but it worries me. I mean, recently, just this month, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, has brought out an article saying, you know, how do we avoid war with China? You know, the fact that people are even thinking in these terms, this is not something we were thinking about, I think, collectively, even 5 years ago. And so I'm concerned.
And the idea that for a while, the popularity of notions like the Thucydides trap, which essentially try to provide a, let's say, a preemptive justification for going to war by saying, of course, we can completely understand why this is going to happen because this is what happens. No. I mean, I don't say that the folks who came up with that idea were cheerleading for war, but the idea that we start to take a sort of fatalistic approach to belief that war has to come.
Very dangerous. And I've looked at I find it so hard to say Thucydides. I've looked at the Thucydides trap, and I've also reread Thucydides himself on the Peloponnesian War. You know, and the Thucydides trap idea is based on one line in the Peloponnesian War, which says Sparta came to fear the growing power of Athens. It doesn't take into account that power does both wanes and grows, and that you have different sorts of powers. And when I read it, I thought, you know, I'm having trouble making out which is the power here, which is the more powerful one and which is the rising one. Athens is a sea power, Sparta is a land power. You know, I think it's more complicated than to say one power is rising, one's going down. That's like snakes and ladders. You know, I just don't think it works. And powers reinvent themselves, they renew themselves, they change, they make alliances. And so I don't find it a helpful way. I dislike the idea of predictive models in history. I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe in contingency, accident, choices.
Which of course is what gives history its, let's say, its tragic power, is to understand that even when terrible things happen, people did have choices, and the choices that they made may have led them into tragedies they were seeking to avoid.
Yeah, or sometimes embracing. I mean, I think, you know, I do think the history of Europe would have been different if Hitler had been killed in the trenches in the First World War. You know, a right-wing nationalistic government might have gone into power in Germany in the beginning of the 1930s, but would it have been dominated by someone who was prepared to destroy Germany and the whole of Europe rather than back down? You know, I think it's unlikely. And the same thing with Stalin. You know, so I think sometimes who's wielding large amounts of powers, I think, can matter, and the choices those people make can matter.
Well, that is a thought-provoking, sometimes somewhat hopeful, although not necessarily, I guess it all depends on who the people are, thought upon which to end this discussion. But I'm afraid that our hour is just about up. And Margaret MacMillan, it's been a delight. There are a lot of questions out there. Lots of people want to ask you more things. I encourage all of them to track down a copy of War, How Conflict Has Shaped Us, so that they can interact with you further. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and joining us today on People, Politics, and Prose.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And FPRI would like to thank all of our sponsors and partners for their generous support of this program. And we encourage you, if you have enjoyed this program, to consider becoming a sponsor or member or partner of FPRI. Thank you for joining us today on Zoom. Today's conversation is coming to an end, but this conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will always be here to discuss it at FPRI. If you have enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Until next time, though, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.